Hey there, and welcome to video 12. Today, we're going to talk about the 4-paragraph introduction. So this will save you time a little bit, but it will mostly save you space. The reason it won't save you a ton of time is because you still have to do the research. So just because we're talking about a 4-paragraph introduction doesn't mean that you only need to look up a few articles. And it doesn't mean that you don't need to know as much. In fact, the 4-paragraph introduction is about concisely summarizing a lot of the research that you did. And so let's go ahead and tell you what belongs in that paragraph, and then you can kind of see how you really still need to do a plenty of research. So this 4-paragraph introduction, first of all, check out Lab 51 in your lab manual. That lab gives a little breakdown of their version of the introduction. I'm going to talk a little bit more about it here. And so between the two of these things, you should be able to get a good sense of what to put in your introduction. Remembering that an introduction is different from a literature review. The introduction pretty much says that here is what is the logic behind this study. It's not here are all of the things, which is more of what a literature review does. So starting this introduction, this assumes that you already know your research question pretty well. You've already done enough research on that question to understand it. And so if you haven't done that, then you will struggle more getting this to happen. But if you go out and read more articles, then it's really not that hard. And also, in order to begin this, you should already have operationalized your variables. In other words, figuring out how you're measuring them, what they are, what are the specifics for your variables. So the first paragraph is this: there's a problem. Okay, so basically you're just saying, here's the problem. What's the problem you're seeking the answer to? Write this down. And then you explain why this is a problem. And so I'd like to show you some examples of opening paragraphs from 3 different articles. So I've picked 3 articles. We're going to use the same 3 articles for each of the 4 paragraphs. And I'll just show you what they did in each of those articles for each of those 4 paragraphs. So here's the first one. This is actually the article from last week's little talk about trembling and PTSD. And so I thought, well, here you've already a little bit familiar with this. So let's start with this one. Now, this paragraph might look scary because it has all of these references in it. And so you might, until you're used to the references, it might look like it's a little bit hard to read. And so let me show it to you without the references. And I separated the sentences out. And so it's just 4 sentences. And so if you look here, there's a ton of references. It looks big, but really this is just 4 sentences. And here are the 4 sentences. The treatment of PTSD has been a topic of much research. Okay, that's your basic generic opening sentence. Even though effective methods have been established, no method has been shown to work for all people. Okay, that's also pretty generic, right? And then they're starting to show what the problem is. Besides evidence-based treatment methods such as, and then what this does is it lists a bunch of evidence-based methods. And then it also lists, in addition to the methods, a reference for each method. So that's partly why this paragraph looks so big. And so besides these methods, quite a number of other additional methods have been proposed, not yet studied. Okay, so that's the problem. We studied one of those additional methods. That's basically what they're saying. So there's this PTSD, a lot of research, some effective methods, and there's some evidence bases for some of them, but then there's other methods that don't have evidence base yet. And so that's what we're doing. We're studying another one of these methods that doesn't have much of an evidence base yet. That's what it is. So we studied this 15-session protocol of somatic experiencing in a randomized controlled trial. So when you put back in the references, so here I've put them all in yellow so you can see how much space they take up versus just the 4 sentences. And here you can look at all of those other methods, prolonged exposure, cognitive processing, brief eclectic psychotherapy, eye movement, EMDR, essentially. So they're listing 4 methods, but it's taking up most of their paragraph because the space involved in supplying references for each of those. We need to supply references. This is data driven. This is science. And so people need to know where you're getting your data from. So you have to put in references. Here's the next example. Now, this is an article on night owls. Evening chronotype is the same thing as night owls. And so it means that you kind of stay up later and you wake up later. Okay. So evening chronotype adolescents follow a delayed sleep-wake schedule compared to the morning chronotypes, which they call larks. So that's their first sentence. The onset of puberty triggers an evening preference among about 40% of youth. Okay, and so then that plus social changes makes it bigger. So that's their second sentences. Eveningness, that's what they're going to call it, particularly among youth who have an early school start time, results in sleep deprivation. Okay, now there's the problem. This pattern is concerning. Sleep is crucial for brain development. And so then they say, okay, this is what we're going to study. Although the biological shift toward eveningness during puberty might be difficult to modify, we test the hypothesis that you can modify basically psychosocial behavior and cognitive contributors to that eveningness. So that's their first paragraph. Beautiful paragraph, right? It really sets up the whole study. And here's the last example. This is another example. I pulled this mainly because I like the way this study was set up. So it's more about the way they set up the study than it is about the content of the study. Probably not super applicable to y'all, maybe to your mothers. Most women experience unpleasant symptoms during their menopausal transition. Okay, so that's that first sentence where you're like, oh, okay, that's what we're talking about. Okay, got it. And then it tells you a little bit more, most common menopausal symptoms. In addition, about 25% of perimenopausal women suffer from depressive symptoms. Now, here is where I want to urge you to freely look up words you don't know. It makes no sense to not look up words you don't know. And when you read the scientific literature, you should be looking up a lot of words. I look up a lot of words when I read it. I don't know all of the things. And so it's important to look up words. Now, I do know perimenopausal, what that means because of my work in perioperative environment studies. And peri means kind of like all around. And so perioperative means before, during, and after an operation. So perimenopause means before, during, and after menopause. And so there's some time before menopause happens. We could call it premenopause, but most of the time people call it perimenopause, like you're around menopause. And so what they're saying is about a quarter of women have depressive symptoms in that time period. Now, hormone therapy is a treatment for symptoms, but many women look at other symptoms, or other treatments. And so their problem is they're saying, look, we need evidence for lifestyle modifications, right? So it's kind of like that last study where they said, okay, there's some evidence for this. We need more evidence for other things. So that's kind of the same idea here. There's evidence for hormone therapy. Other people like to do other things. We need some evidence to see if it really works. So those are the 3 examples of a first paragraph. Make sense? If it doesn't, rewind and listen to it again, because I think that will really help you. A lot of times what you have to do when you're learning something is hear it a few times. That's normal. Don't think of that as that you're especially slow, because it totally doesn't mean that. It's normal. And it's the sign of a good student to go back and just make sure this happens. Now, the 4-paragraph intro is something that you're going to have a lot of connection with in the next couple weeks. And so it makes sense to me to just spend the time to go back and listen again. Okay, second paragraph. And this video is going to just be a little bit longer so I can get all 4 paragraphs in one video and be it, thorough enough. So the second variable is usually what happens in the second paragraph. Sometimes it's like, okay, I just need to give you more information about the context. Anyway, the second paragraph just expands on information that you need to set up your study. And so you might say, if you're looking at a second variable that you haven't introduced yet in the first paragraph, the second paragraph is when to introduce that variable. So you might say, well, here's this other thing that's relevant. It might be something like, okay, so we've done a lot of look at antidepressant medications, and yet they still have some problematic side effects. What if that's my first paragraph? Then the second paragraph might be, hey, but there's this other thing, there's some plant-based substances that seem to help with depression as well. And here's some stuff about that. So that would be an example of introducing another variable that you haven't introduced in the first paragraph, or you might introduce it in the first paragraph and then follow up with more information in the second paragraph. So you want to say, here's this other thing that's relevant. Here's some research that has been done in the past. If this takes you more than one paragraph, it's fine. It might take you 2 paragraphs to be thorough enough. It might just take you 1. So we'll show you what the examples are. Example 1 has 2 paragraphs. No, maybe it's just 1 really long paragraph. Shoot, I can't remember. I think it's 1 long paragraph. Anyway, so remember, example 1 was about somatic experiencing. So it tells you more about somatic experiencing. So if you go back to this first paragraph where we had PTSD is much research, effective methods, here's some evidence-based, here's one that hasn't been studied yet. It's somatic experiencing. That's what it is. And so then the second paragraph is somatic experiencing is. So let me tell you all about somatic experiencing in a concise way. And so that's the purpose of this second paragraph. It's a body focus therapy. Here's what it's used for. Here's what the focus is. Here's the theoretical perspective. Here's the goal, right? And then it's different from exposure therapy. This is how it's different. This is what the client does, right? So then you understand enough about somatic experiencing so that the study makes sense to you. Okay, the second study is, remember, about eveningness, the larks and the night owls, right? And so they're saying, maybe we can change some of the things to make it so that we can modify this eveningness that happens in adolescence, because sleep is really important, right? So let me tell you more about eveningness, right? So that's here, the second paragraph. Let me tell you more about this, more about eveningness associated with adverse consequences in the emotional domain, in the behavioral domain, and then in the social domain. So here are all the adverse consequences. And then it says longitudinal studies show that it predicts heightened risk, and it's alarming. So this is a priority in health. That's their second paragraph. Third paragraph, they're introducing the next variable. So in the first paragraph, you remember they said perimenopause is associated with depression. Hormone therapy is something that's been used, but there are other things people also do. Okay, then it says, here's one of the other things, exercise. So let me tell you about exercise. Here's what exercise is doing. Here's some of the research on exercise. So exercise can alleviate menopausal depressive symptoms. We know that, but we don't have enough evidence to support it. And so we've looked at aerobic exercise. We've looked at moderate to vigorous intensity exercise in depression. We see that exercise has a pretty decent, I mean, they don't say it's decent, but you'll learn, negative 0.62. A 0.62 effect size is a pretty decent effect size, moderate. So although the data is up and down, equivocal, we're looking at, we need more evidence based on randomized controlled trials. And so they're basically saying, exercise is a thing. Here are some of the things we've learned about it, but we need more randomized controlled trials. Some of the previous studies looked at moderate to vigorous, but that might actually trigger hot flashes. So let's look at light intensity exercise. Now, I don't love the way they said light intensity exercise. I would love to say low intensity exercise, because when I hear light intensity exercise, what I hear is that you're doing it in the sunlight, right? You're doing it in a light intensive environment. And so you just have to read the paragraph and realize That's not what they mean. They mean low intensity, light intensity, not moderate, not vigorous, but instead lightweight exercise. And so they're saying let's look at lightweight exercise in a randomized control trial. So that's paragraph 2. Paragraph 3, see if there's some research that looks at the combination of what you're looking at in your study. And so maybe we looked at some stuff about that second variable in the second paragraph. What about the combination in the third paragraph? Is there anything that looks at the two variables together, or maybe just you need, a little bit more background? So what research has been done on what you're looking at? And so in example 1, we go back to somatic experiencing, right? To date, we don't see much literature on somatic experiencing. So that's what they said. There, remember the first paragraph was, okay, PTSD has some treatments, but there's some treatments that haven't been looked at. Let's look at them. Paragraph 2, somatic experiencing is one of those treatments. Paragraph 3 here, this is the literature, the effectiveness of somatic experiencing. There's not a lot of research out there on this, right? So they explained in the second paragraph what it was, what somatic experiencing is. The third paragraph, they're explaining, here's what it says in the literature. And so they give some examples, and there's not much out there, right? We've got tsunami survivors. That's kind of what we have. They use 2 paragraphs here for this section because they looked at 2 different research interventions. And so the first one was on tsunamis, and the second one was also on tsunamis. And so this is all there is. So they're saying somatic experiencing is a thing. That was their second paragraph. And then they use the next 2 paragraphs to describe research on somatic experiencing, which is not much. All right. The next example, remembering eveningness and morningness. And so they said at first, maybe we can modify eveningness with psychosocial, behavioral, and cognitive processes. And then there's this thing about how does that work? So if we go back, to example 2, how does it work, eveningness? How does all of that happen? What are the things about eveningness, right? So they want to modify it, and they're saying, here are some things that might be effective in our intervention. So one of the things I want you to notice about this is people do it different ways, and it's fine. But the basic overall ideas are pretty similar when you go across this kind of 4-paragraph idea for an introduction. So here they said, here's our goal. This is what we want to do. We want to do it using this transdiagnostic sleep and circadian intervention. So it's kind of like they're saying, all right, eveningness is a thing. Here are all the bad things about eveningness. That was paragraph 2, right? And paragraph 3 is, hey, here's this intervention called transdiagnostic sleep and circadian intervention, right? So they wanted the goal was to fix or to modify. Let's use this intervention, transdiagnostic intervention. And so they tell a little bit about transdiagnostic sleep and circadian intervention, the TransSC, to looking at research and treatment. It's a new approach, and it kind of tells a little bit about that and some research that's been done with it. Prior youth sleep treatment tend to be disorder focused. Here we're looking at across disorders. That's what they mean by transdiagnostic. That's why it might be more useful. Okay, so that's the second example for this third paragraph. And then the third paragraph, now we're going to talk more about light intensity exercise, remembering that's low intensity, right? This is how it's defined, and this is the research about it. And so they're saying the basic causes seem to be related to the autonomic nervous system, in addition to declining estrogen levels. Therefore, what they've seen earlier in light intensity exercise might help. So they're saying, okay, well, maybe stretching is enough to really help. So what this, and you'll see this when we look at paragraph 4, they did everything in these 3 paragraphs, because this, when it says therefore, that's sort of like the beginning. They could have put that in a 4th paragraph, but they put it here still in the 3rd Fine. But that is essentially their fourth paragraph. Therefore, and that's what we do in the fourth paragraph. We set up our study. Therefore, this study will, and this is where you tell us why is your study the next logical step, given what you've said so far in the introduction. So what you want your introduction to do is really set you up. It's like a logical way of saying, here are the things. And so obviously this is the study that has to happen. So example 1, which says, other methods seem to be common practice. The effectiveness of somatic experiencing hasn't yet been proven in a randomized controlled setting. So therefore, you're like, oh, so that makes sense. Of course, you're going to do a randomized controlled setting for somatic experiencing. Yeah, I'm ready. Now tell me exactly what you're going to do. And that's what the methods is, methods section. Second example. Here we've got in this study, let me tell you more about this study. So instead of a therefore, the therefore is kind of implied. And so they don't really say therefore, but they could have said, therefore, we're going to look at. So here they just say, well, okay, so in this study, we're looking at adolescents who are eveningness adolescents, and they're allocated randomly to either get the trans SC or just psychoeducation. And so that's a randomized controlled trial of their intervention versus comparing it to just education, just psychoeducation. And then they give you their hypothesis. We think that the trans SC will improve their sleep and their circadian function more than the psychoeducation. Okay, example 3, like I said, that last part of the third paragraph was therefore. Stretching might help. The purpose of the study is to examine the effects of stretching on menopausal and depressive symptoms in middle-aged women. Perfect. Okay, so here your overall goal, again, is help someone understand why your study makes sense. You want to give them just enough background so the logic is clear. And so this is about being thorough and concise. You want to support what you're doing with data from the literature. This is what you're doing here, data from the literature. You're not just talking about why it makes sense logic-wise. You must have data that you're relying on. So you have to have references. Okay, so now you try it. Sum up, 4-paragraph introduction. You use the literature to set up your study. You don't use your thinking as much as you use the literature. Or, I mean, of course, you're going to use your thinking, right? Like, obviously you are. But you have to use research in text citations to show that you have data to support you. You want to be concise, but thorough enough to tell the story. Okay, hopefully this helped you. And I'll talk to you next time.